Hello, everybody. My name is Scott Bossard, and in this presentation today, we will examine the rapidly evolving relationship between the United States and Venezuela. So my goal here in this presentation will to be provide a clear, realistic assessment of where things stand, and then outline a strategy that strengthens the U.S. interests while supporting a more stable and democratic Venezuela. Okay, so here's how the presentation is structured. I'm going to first begin with some quick facts to kind of ground us in the current situation. Then I'll move through the historical context, the current relationship, and the national security environment, and then also the role of the international organizations that both countries are part of. We'll then conclude with a forward-looking strategy on what the U.S. should do next. All right, so some quick facts on Venezuela. Venezuela has a population of around 30 million, and it has the world's largest oil reserves and a significant amount of mineral wealth. However, its economy has contracted more than 75% since 2014, and this has led to over 8 million people leave the country. It's one of the largest displacement crises in the entire world. So this collapse has reshaped the region, and neighboring states are kind of absorbing these migrants, and the illicit economies in Venezuela have expanded. So to understand anything in the current time, we need to understand the history first. The relationship between the U.S. and Venezuela started off defined by strategic alignment rather than any confrontation. The U.S. formally recognized Venezuela in 1835 and was actually the second government to do so after Brazil. Some influential Venezuelan leaders like Simón Bolívar had engaged with the U.S. political ideas like liberty and republicanism. Around that time, the Monroe Doctrine became the backbone of U.S. foreign policy in the region, and the U.S. positioned itself as the hemispheric protector. Around 1922, Venezuela became a producer of oil, and this, as you can guess, transformed the relationship between the U.S. and Venezuela. And it was about that time Venezuela was the U.S.'s most important energy partner. Starting in around 1958, there were about 4 decades of democracy in Venezuela, and that kind of gave relative stability and strong U.S. alignment. However, in 1999, a dramatic rupture would occur with the rise of Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez was elected president in 1999, and that marked a turning point for U.S. and Venezuela relations. Chavez and his allies reworked the constitution, removed term limits, and consolidated power for him to stay legally in power indefinitely. Chavez framed his whole revolution as explicitly anti-imperialist, aligning with Cuba and Russia, which the U.S. viewed as attempting to destabilize the hemisphere. After Chavez's death in 2013, Nicolás Maduro inherited the leadership role, and he continued to consolidate power further. However, almost immediately, due to some poor policy choices, an economic collapse occurred, and citizens fled for better opportunity elsewhere. Due to some narco-trafficking issues, the U.S. adopted sanctions against regime leaders in an attempt to punish the leadership of Venezuela rather than the people themselves. However, this relationship would reach a boiling point in 2026. Now, currently, Venezuela is undergoing the most dramatic political shift in its modern history. Now, as many of you are aware, in January 2026, the United States conducted a surprise military operation that captured Maduro and extradited him to New York to face narco-terrorism charges. This was the most assertive U.S. regime change action in the Western Hemisphere in decades. President Trump stated that the United States would run Venezuela until a transition can occur. This signaled a dramatic shift from the past sanctions-based pressure to now direct involvement in Venezuela's political future. In the aftermath of this, Vice President Delcy Rodriguez was sworn in as acting president. For Venezuelans inside and outside the country, the mood is a mixture of hope, fear, and uncertainty. A majority welcomed the end of Maduro's rule, but now they question whether Rodriguez represents genuine change or simply a new face for the same system. Some question if the U.S. will support a transition back to democracy, or if the U.S. is just there to exploit their resources. So currently, Venezuela is a fluid yet gravely important transitional moment. There is no doubt that the U.S. plays a central role in this. An authoritarian was removed, but a volatile power vacuum now remains. Before I can get into any strategy, it's important to understand the economic and cultural ties between the US and Venezuela. The current economic relationship is in flux, as you can imagine. Sanctions currently still remain in place, but the US now has control to calibrate oil licenses and provide economic relief based on cooperation from Venezuela. Culturally, the relationship is deeper than the political crisis suggests. Both countries are majority Christian and have many shared values. The Venezuelan diaspora in the United States is well over 500,000 and is deeply engaged, especially in cities like Miami. Now let's look at the relationship in terms of national security. From a national security perspective, Venezuela is a hub for narco-trafficking and state-enabled criminal networks. Maduro's capture removed the head of a narco-terrorism network known as the Cartel of the Suns, but the underlying structure of this still remains. Elements of Venezuela's military, intelligence service, and colectivos continue to facilitate trafficking. Along the Colombian border, ELN and FARC, who are non-state armed factions, continue to operate inside Venezuelan territory. These groups thrive in weak governance environments, and the current political vacuum can create an opportunity for them to expand. Any U.S. strategy must account for this reality. The national security environment is also shaped by outside states, who have used the country as a strategic foothold in the Western Hemisphere. Russia, Iran, Cuba, and China have all built significant influence in Venezuela. Russia, for example, provides military advisors and political backing, and Cuba remains deeply embedded in Venezuela's security apparatus. Given the current situations in the world, though, like the Ukraine war, Iran war, and Maduro's capture, now these state actors are faced with reassessing their position. Some may attempt to protect their investment or influence the transition. Others may now try to distance themselves to avoid any confrontation with the United States. For the U.S., the priority is ensuring that Venezuela does not become a proxy arena for any geopolitical competition, and that their adversarial powers cannot exploit the instability or expand their footprint in the hemisphere. Now, let's look at the opportunities for multilateral diplomacy. Two of the major international organizations that the U.S. and Venezuela are a part of are the United Nations and the Organization of American States, also known as OAS. The OAS has historically been the primary forum for responding to democratic crises in the Western Hemisphere. Nicaragua and Cuba are the only states that are not members. Venezuela is currently a disputed member. The reaction of these member states to Maduro's capture was notably muted. Many states avoided strong statements, not out of just indifference, but because they faced domestic political pressures like migration challenges. Every country in the hemisphere has been affected by Venezuela's collapse, and I believe this creates an opportunity for coordinated engagement if the political will exists. The OAS could play a constructive role in shaping the transition, but only if the member states choose to engage collectively rather than just remain on the sidelines. The current situation may look pretty dim. However, I believe with the right policy, a strong bond can build and shape the future, not just for Venezuela, but for the entire Western Hemisphere. Any realistic strategy or policy must acknowledge its constraints. So let's look at what's not working. Historically, regional responses to any crisis has been fragmented. Without a coordinated hemispheric approach, no single country, including the United States, can stabilize Venezuela on its own. Unilateral pressure and diplomatic isolation weakened the Venezuelan regime, but it did not dismantle the criminal networks or non-state armed groups that operate in its borders. U.S. intelligence sharing with Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, and others has produced some tactical successes historically, but it has not dismantled cartels or armed groups. These groups adapt quickly and exploit Venezuelans' territory, and they operate in regions where state presence is weak or compromised by corruption. Another issue not working is the humanitarian crisis continues to destabilize the region. So any future strategy must address these economic structural challenges rather than just rely on pressure alone. The people of Venezuela, they cannot be the ones that suffer if any change is going to actually work. Finally, and most importantly, there is a trust issue. Nations are cautious about the US's intentions. This is shaped by historical interventions and perceived double standards. The Trump administration's transactional policy in other regions of the world is not helping either. A relationship based solely on oil transactions or the president's personal profit, they result in short-term gains without any long-term legitimacy, and and a transition that Venezuelan transition that would remain vulnerable to spoils and to great power competition. The reality is Venezuela's government is significantly weakened, and the US has incredible leverage. Maduro has been eliminated from the equation, and now there's a golden opportunity to shape a positive future in the region. However, I believe the strategy must be bold, disciplined, multilateral, benchmarked, and transparent in order for it to be long-lasting. I propose that the US should pivot towards a Western Hemisphere partnership model, and that means increasing the capabilities of OAS and rebuilding a regional coalition through it with Colombia, Brazil, Chile, Mexico, and the Caribbean states. Cooperating with others builds invaluable trust. Regional partners who trust the US will help the US in other aspects like deterring US rivals from profiting or disrupting the region. To center legitimacy in Venezuela, I propose that the US should require internationally monitored elections and judicial reforms as the precondition for phased economic normalization. And this should be followed by conditional sanction relief and coordinated stabilization packages that prioritize things like cash for work, social safety nets, and incentives to encourage diaspora investment back into the country to jumpstart the economy. Democratic values must also guide any US engagement, not just because of idealism, but because democratic institutions produce more stable partners and reduce long-term security risks. This should be public knowledge too, and make use of informational campaigns in a positive way so that Venezuelan citizens know that help will come if they build and hold their democratic institutions. Another proposal is security cooperation must be stronger and bolder and focused on the root causes. The US should increase partner-led security task forces focused on counter-narcotics, anti-smuggling, and judicial vetting to break the state criminal fusion. The focus from the US should be on sharing more of its unmatched intelligence capabilities and providing more technical assistance like artificial intelligence to help these governments dismantle the cartels. The United States cannot and should not do this alone. In this strategy, America gets a stable trade partner and can start diversifying critical supply chains in the region. It starts fixing the core of its domestic concerns, like migration and illegal drug imports, while benefiting its own defense and intelligence industry. And most importantly, it builds critical trust in the region that'll be needed in the future when rivals will try to exploit. A good strategy is one that can be implemented. I believe for my proposed strategy that implementation requires three parallel tracks. Track one is to create political benchmarks with an OAS Transitional Council that will monitor elections, counter disinformation, and oversee judicial vetting. Track two is to stabilize the economy, and this means working with the Inter-American Development Bank with some emergency financing, some debt restructuring, some targeted cash programs, and use diaspora bonds and guarantees to mobilize private capital under strict transparency rules. Track three is security and rule of law. The US should beef up partner-led narcotics units, and this means increasing pressure on non-state armed groups like FARC and ELN by sharing intelligence and technical resources. The US and Mexico recently performed an example of this against the Jalisco New Generation cartel. There are some real risks, though, to these implementations. Regional political divisions could slow down cooperation. Criminal networks will try to exploit the transition, as we talked about, and perceptions of U.S. overreach could undermine legitimacy. And also, the economic instability, may even persist with reforms. To mitigate these risks, the U.S. must ensure the process is are visibly multilateral, and they should publish clear benchmarks and timelines. ensure security assistance is partner-led and conditioned on judicial reforms, and require independent audits of reconstruction funds. If benchmarks slipped, then we need to have pre-agreed contingency measures in place. In closing, Venezuela stands at a pivotal moment. Maduro's capture has created a rare, fragile, and finite opening, one that could allow the country to move toward democratic stabilization after years of authoritarian rule and humanitarian suffering. U.S. leadership is necessary, but it is not sufficient alone. The crisis has touched every country in the hemisphere and has created shared burdens and shared incentives. Success depends on multilateral engagement, transparent benchmarks, and tying economic relief to democratic and judicial reforms. If the U.S. gets this strategy right, a stable, democratic Venezuela can reduce migration pressures, it can weaken illicit economies, and it can strengthen democratic norms across all of Latin America. That outcome is possible, and it is in the United States' best interest. Venezuela's future will be shaped not by one nation, but by a hemisphere led by the U.S., choosing shared responsibility. The Western Hemisphere can be a positive example to the international order, with the U.S.'s policy regarding Venezuela as the cornerstone. I'll leave with a quote from Bill Clinton on a state visit in 1997 before the era of Chavez and Maduro. He stated, "The United States and Venezuela share a long tradition of friendship and democratic values." I put this here because I believe it's these shared values that we must lean on to create a positive future between the U.S., Venezuela, and the Western Hemisphere overall. Thank you very much for spending time listening to this presentation. Once again, my name is Scott Bozzard, and it was a pleasure speaking to you about my proposal for U.S.'s foreign policy with Venezuela. Thank you very much.